Hi again. Kenneth Scott Latourette, History of Christianity, page 228. The further development of monasticism. In the 4th and 5th centuries, monasticism spread widely and monks multiplied. Monks and monasteries were especially numerous in the east, notably in Egypt, Mesopotamia, Palestine, and Syria, partly because in the latter two countries pre-monastic asceticism had been strong in Christian circles. In Mesopotamia, they seem to have had beginnings which were quite independent of influences from Egypt. They may have been indebted to Manichaean monasticism, and through that to Buddhist and Hindu asceticism. Monks and monasteries were also present in the West. All three kinds of monks were found: the solitaries, who were especially numerous in Palestine, those whose cells were grouped into a loose community, a lora, and those dwelling in the highly organized groups, of which Pachomius had been a pioneer. Some of the monks practiced extreme austerities. There were the pillar saints, those who lived on the top of pillars. One of the earliest and quite the most famous of them was Simeon Stylites, or Stylites, who died in 459. He dwelt on his pillar east of Antioch for 36 years. Is said to have touched his feet with his forehead more than 1,244 times in succession, and to have dripped with vermin. His fame spread, and multitudes, including some high state officials, came to see him. Other monks were immured in cells, some of them so small that they could neither lie at full length nor stand at full height. In one group the monks are reported to have subsisted on grass, which they cut with sickles. Some monks passed many nights without sleep. Others went for days without food. The extreme ascetics were popularly esteemed athletes of God. Many were said to work miracles of healing. More numerous than these individualistic ascetics were the monks who lived in communities according to rule. After Pachomius, the most famous pioneer in the east of this form of monasticism was Basil of Caesarea, whom we have already met as a scion of a wealthy, earnestly Christian family, and as one of the three great Cappadocian champions and interpreters of Nicene orthodoxy. In 358, then, in his late 20s, Basil visited Egypt and was profoundly impressed by what he saw there of the Pachomian monasteries. During their student days at Athens, he and Gregory of Nazianzus agreed to join in living the ascetic life. The ascetic life had appeared among the Christians in his native country some time before Basil's return home, and Eustathius, bishop of Sebaste, northeast of Caesarea, had already founded monasteries. Although later separated on questions of doctrine, Basil and Eustathius were for a time close friends. Moreover, Basil's mother, one of his sisters, Macrina, and a younger brother began in Pontus the nucleus of a community for simple Christian living, which later was to develop into a nunnery. Indeed, Macrina was looked back to as the founder of women's conventual life in the Greek portion of the Catholic Church. Basil distributed part of his property among the poor and embarked on the monastic life in a secluded spot across the river from this establishment. Others joined him. He did not condemn Christians who married, but he believed celibacy and asceticism to be the higher way. Basil was not long permitted to give himself exclusively to the monastic discipline, for he was drawn into the general life of the church, into its theological controversies, and eventually into its administration as a bishop. In this he was a prototype of many outstanding monks, both in the East and the West. They found that they could not withdraw completely from the world or from the church as a whole, but must participate in them. Yet, in the intervals which he devoted to the monastic life, Basil worked out a set of rules which helped to shape monasticism in the Catholic Church, both in the East and the West. These were not in one formal piece of legislation, but were directions for the ascetic life contained in several writings, especially what are known as the longer rules and the shorter rules. Here is not the place for a full description or even an adequate summary of these directions. In them, Basil was deeply indebted to what he had seen in the Pachomian monasteries in Egypt. Yet he was no slavish imitator, but was rather a creator. He knit the monastery into more of a community than had Pachomius. In general, Basil advocated that the ascetics dwell together in communities rather than in solitude, declaring that association with others was necessary to the full Christian life, such as the practice of the law of love to one's neighbor. In the community, room was to be found for both work and prayer. Extreme austerity was to be avoided, for after testing it in his first years of the ascetic life, Basil had found it unfruitful. Food was to be simple and inexpensive, and during the common meal a book was to be read. Work was for the supplying of the needs of the monastery, and was varied, with preference given to agriculture, and chief honor paid to intellectual labor, especially the study of the scriptures. The monastery had its officers, with a superior over them all, chosen by the heads of neighboring monasteries, and after a period of probation, accepted by his brethren. The superior was to seek the counsel of senior brethren. The obedience of the monk was to be absolute, and the commitment was for life. Entrance to a monastery did not necessarily entail the renunciation of all the postulant's property, but he was to distribute at least part of it to the poor, taking care to do so with wisdom, remembering that he held it in trust from God. The monks were to make frequent confession of their sins, probably to one or another of the more mature of their brethren, not necessarily to a priest. After entering the monastery, the monks were to have as little contact as possible with their families, for this would embroil them with the world and its affairs. The monastery as a whole, through its official almoner, gave aid to the poor outside its walls, more especially to those who were dedicated to God. Boys were received to be educated in a religious manner, but were largely kept separate from the monks. The monasteries did not form a closely knit order, but constituted a kind of loose federation, and in time of need, the richer were supposed to come to the assistance of the poorer. The monks were mostly laymen, and the bishops seem to have had no control over them or the monasteries, except that the formal admission to the monastic life was in the presence of a bishop. Yet Basil himself, as we have seen, became a bishop, and he made important contributions towards bringing the monastic life into the life of the Catholic Church as a whole. He and his monks became champions of orthodoxy, and he set the example of a man of learning and outstanding gifts of organization, giving himself both to the ascetic life and to the Church. I'll put in a link to a discussion by Michael Green as to how the greatest Caesar, that is Caesar Augustus, prepared the world for Christianity. See you soon.